Chapter 361. The Expedition. Duke's Mansion. Early morning. The air in the bathing chamber was warm, the scent of lavender and herbs lingering in the steam that rose from the water. Aeliana sat still in the large, ornate tub, her slender form submerged to the shoulders as she endured the gentle ministrations of the maids. The water swirled softly around her, its heat soothing the ever-present ache in her muscles, but her mind was far from at ease. The maids moved with practiced precision, their hands working carefully to cleanse her without hesitation. Their eyes, however, remained closed, as per her explicit instructions. They had learned early on that to disobey this rule, to so much as glance at her skin, was to face her wrath, a punishment no one dared provoke. Aeliana's fingers gripped the edges of the tub, her knuckles pale against the polished porcelain. The sound of water sloshing and the soft murmur of the maids' movements filled the room, but she could sense their unease, even if they tried to hide it. They always did. "Turn your head slightly, my lady," one of the maids said, her tone neutral, her hands poised to rinse Aeliana's hair. Aeliana complied without a word, tilting her head back as warm water poured gently over her dark tresses. The maids avoided her skin as much as possible, their hands brushing her hair and robes only when absolutely necessary. Another maid reached for a soft cloth and began to scrub Aeliana's arms, her motions delicate yet thorough. The heat of the water made the marks on Aeliana's skin more visible beneath the surface, the blackened lines, the cracked and uneven texture that marred her once perfect complexion. Even with their eyes closed, the maids could feel the texture beneath their fingers, but they dared not react. Aeliana's lips pressed into a thin line, her jaw tightening as she watched them work. "Do it quickly," she said coldly, her voice cutting through the quiet. The maids flinched slightly but nodded, their hands moving more briskly. "Yes, my lady," one replied softly, her voice wavering just enough to betray her nerves. When the bath was done, the maids guided her out of the tub with care, their eyes still tightly shut as they wrapped her in a thick embroidered towel. Aeliana allowed them to pat her dry, her movements stiff and deliberate as she tried to avoid their touch. The heat of the bath lingered on her skin, mingling with the prickling discomfort of being exposed, even if no one could see her. The comb moved through her damp hair in steady, rhythmic strokes, the sound oddly soothing. For a moment, Aeliana closed her eyes, letting herself sink into the sensation. But it didn't last. Her thoughts clawed at her, relentless and cruel. "This is who I've become," she thought, her hands clenching the fabric of the towel tightly. "A creature so pitiful that I can't even bear to let them see me." After drying her, the maids moved with efficient precision, fetching the simple garments that made up Aeliana's wardrobe. The clothes were plain, unadorned blouses and skirts, chosen for their practicality rather than elegance. Aeliana had long abandoned the elaborate silks and embroidered gowns that once defined her station. What was the point, when no one could see them beneath her ever-present veil and robe? The first maid helped her into the blouse, the fabric soft but functional, slipping over her shoulders with practiced ease. The second maid adjusted the skirt, fastening it securely at her waist. Their hands were quick, careful, and deliberately impersonal. Their eyes remained shut, their expressions neutral, as though willing themselves to become invisible. Aeliana watched them silently, her jaw tightening with every moment. She hated this, hated the necessity of their hands on her, of their presence in her most vulnerable moments. But she said nothing, her pride and her shame locking the words in her throat. When the final button was fastened, the maids stepped back in unison, bowing their heads slightly as they waited for her next instruction. Aeliana turned away from them, reaching for the thick, dark robe that hung over a nearby chair. She draped it over her shoulders, the heavy fabric settling around her like a second skin. The veil came last, its soft material brushing against her face as she adjusted it carefully to ensure no trace of her skin was visible. The maids waited silently until she turned back to them, her veiled figure now completely concealed. "You may go," she said curtly, her voice cold and detached. "Yes, my lady," they replied in unison, their heads bowing once more before they quietly exited the room. For a moment, Eliana stood in the silence, her hands clutching the edges of her robe. Her heart was heavy, her breath slow and deliberate as she tried to steady herself. The bath had done little to ease the ache in her body or the weight on her mind. A knock at the door broke her reverie. "My lady, are you ready?" A voice called from the other side. It was steady, polite, and unmistakably familiar. Madalena, her attendant and the one tasked with overseeing her during the expedition. Eliana's fingers curled around the edge of her robe. "Enter," she said, her voice measured but edged with weariness. The door opened, and Madalena stepped inside. Her presence was calm and composed, her uniform pristine and her demeanor professional. Her gaze swept over Eliana briefly, her expression giving away nothing as she regarded the veiled figure before her. "The preparations are complete," Madalena said, clasping her hands in front of her. "The carriage is ready, and the knights have been briefed. I trust you are prepared as well." Eliana nodded once, her movements slow and deliberate. "I am," she replied, her tone clipped. "Very well," Madalena said. "If you require anything further before we depart, now is the time." "I require nothing," Eliana said, her voice firm. "Let us go." Madalena nodded, stepping aside to hold the door open. Eliana straightened her posture, adjusting the folds of her robe one final time before stepping forward. Her steps were steady, but each one felt heavier than the last, the weight of anticipation and trepidation bearing down on her. The corridor stretched ahead, lined with servants who bowed their heads as she passed. They didn't look at her, didn't dare lift their eyes, and Eliana was both grateful and resentful for their deference. This was it, her first step outside the confines of her room in years, even if it was only to watch from afar. It wasn't freedom, not truly, but it was something, and for now it would have to be enough. Lucavion arrived at the designated gathering place, a sprawling open courtyard near Stormhaven's harbor. The air buzzed with tension and energy as dozens of individuals milled about, their armor and weapons gleaming under the afternoon sun. His sharp eyes swept over the crowd, noting the variety of personnel gathered. Adventurers in mismatched gear exchanged stories and adjusted their equipment, their expressions a mix of excitement and unease. Mercenaries stood in tight-knit groups, their stances radiating practiced confidence. Soldiers from the Duke's household, clad in uniformed armor, moved with disciplined precision as they lined up in formation. Among them were mages, their robes marked with arcane symbols, speaking quietly among themselves as faint traces of mana shimmered around them. Lucavion adjusted his coat as he stepped closer, his presence unnoticed by most but drawing a few curious glances from those who felt the quiet intensity he carried. "Quite the gathering," Vitaliera remarked, her glowing form perched lightly on his shoulder. "Everyone looks so prepared." Prepared? But for what? Lucavion thought, his dark eyes narrowing slightly as he observed the assembly. A raised platform at the front of the courtyard caught his attention. Standing atop it was a tall man in ornate armor bearing the Duke's crest, a golden trident crossed with a sword. His commanding presence left little doubt that he was an officer of high rank. "Captain Idrin, you certainly know how to look cool." As if on cue, the murmurs of the crowd quieted. The officer raised a hand, his voice cutting through the air with practiced authority. "Members of the expedition, hear me?" The gathered crowd fell silent, their attention focused on the platform. "Our mission is critical," Idrin began, his tone steady and deliberate. "The monsters we face have infested the sea trading routes, threatening the lifeblood of our region's commerce and stability. This is not a simple hunt. It is a battle to secure our survival and prosperity." Lucavion listened intently, his dark eyes gleaming faintly as he caught the subtle weight behind Idrin's words. "As you all know," Idrin continued, "sea warfare is vastly different from land warfare. The terrain is unpredictable, and the battles chaotic. Fighting on shifting waters adds layers of difficulty even for the most experienced among us." Lucavion noted the flickers of doubt in some faces, contrasted with the calm resolve in others. "But well, that is the case for a normal place. There is a reason we, Duchy of Thaddeus, is the strongest naval force in the entire world. Chapter 362. The Expedition 2. But well, that is the case for a normal place. There is a reason we, Duchy of Thaddeus, is the strongest naval force in the entire world. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a mix of acknowledgement and unease. Lucavion noted the flickers of doubt in some faces, contrasted with the calm resolve in others. The strategy is simple, the officer said, raising his voice slightly to recapture the room. Our mages will create stable platforms, ground, if you will, on the water itself. These constructs will serve as our battlefields, allowing our adventurers, soldiers, and knights to engage the monsters as if on land. But make no mistake, the sea is a harsh mistress. These platforms are not unshakable fortresses. They will require constant maintenance from the mages, and coordination will be key. Lucavion's brows lifted slightly at the explanation. It was bold, creative, and dangerously ambitious. Turning the sea into land, how very human. Vitaliera mused, her tone carrying a note of respect. It's audacious, Lucavion thought, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. But it just might work. The officer continued, his gaze scanning the crowd. You have been selected because you are among the best in your fields. Adventurers, knights, mages, mercenaries. All of you bring something invaluable to this mission. Together, we will overcome this threat and reclaim our seas. A chorus of cheers and raised weapons followed his words, the energy in the courtyard surging as the gathered forces rallied around the officer's conviction. Lucavion remained silent, his smirk lingering as he observed the crowd's reaction. The plan was dangerous, but it had the hallmarks of genius and desperation. You're impressed, aren't you? Vitaliera teased, her tone knowing. I'll admit, it's intriguing, Lucavion replied inwardly, his gaze shifting toward the mages. But the question remains, will they pull it off? And where do you fit in all this? Lucavion chuckled softly as he adjusted his coat. Right where I always do, Vitaliera. Which is? At the center of the chaos. Captain Edrin, now standing before the gathered crowd, surveyed them with a sharp, measured gaze. His posture exuded confidence, and his voice carried over the courtyard with unyielding authority. All of you, he began, his tone firm but clear, have been assigned to specific stations as per your registration. You will report to the ships designated for your stations, where your respective captains will provide further instructions. The success of this mission depends on discipline and unity. Disperse now and proceed to your assigned areas. As he descended from the platform, the crowd, which had been a buzzing mass of adventurers, mercenaries, mages, and soldiers, began to shift into motion. The knights of the duchy maintained order with remarkable efficiency, their presence a reminder of the iron authority the Duchy of Thaddeus wielded. Even the unruliest adventurers, known for their aggression and impulsive behavior, complied under the weight of the duchy's reputation. None dared to provoke the power represented here. Lucavion observed the dispersing crowd, his sharp eyes catching the subtle tension in some, the quiet confidence in others. A faint smirk curled his lips, an orchestra of chaos, held together by discipline. How quaint. He adjusted his coat and began making his way toward the fourth station's ship, his gait as measured as ever. At the ship docked for the fourth station, the atmosphere was different. The vessel was large and imposing, its sails marked with the crest of the duchy, a golden trident crossed with a sword. Around it, personnel were busy loading supplies, checking equipment, and coordinating tasks. The hum of preparation was steady, a stark contrast to the scattered noise of the courtyard earlier. Lucavion approached with his usual casual demeanor, yet his presence seemed to draw attention. A few heads turned, curiosity sparking in their eyes, but none lingered long. His aura of quiet intensity was enough to deter idle chatter. It's impressive how organized they are, Vitaliera remarked from her perch on his shoulder, her glowing form shimmering faintly in the sunlight. It's fear, Lucavion replied inwardly, his eyes scanning the bustling activity. Fear of the sea, fear of failure, and fear of the duchy's wrath. And what about you? Vitalyara's voice carried a teasing lilt. What do you fear? Lucavion smirked, his gaze narrowing as he approached the gangplank. I fear nothing. Really? Yep. Is that so? As Lucavion stepped onto the gangplank, the muted hum of the ship's preparations shifted subtly. Conversations dropped in volume, movements slowed, and more than a few heads turned in his direction. Their eyes trailed him, some curious, others assessing, a few openly skeptical. The air grew heavier, tension mingling with the salt and brine of the sea breeze. Lucavion's smirk didn't falter as he met their stares, his gaze unflinching and laced with his signature mixture of amusement and calculation. Sizing me up, are we? Fair enough. He casually adjusted his coat, letting his posture exude a confidence that was neither overstated nor easily ignored. But Lucavion wasn't one to merely accept scrutiny without returning it. His sharp eyes swept across the gathering, cataloging every detail with clinical precision. The first group he noted consisted of adventurers, their mismatched gear and hardened expressions betraying lives lived on the edge of danger. Despite their rough appearances, he sensed a practiced discipline in their stances, a readiness that hinted at battles survived and lessons learned. Then came the mercenaries, clustered in tight-knit groups. Their leather armor and well-worn weapons bore the scars of countless skirmishes, and their eyes carried a weight that only came from seeing too much. They exchanged low words, their hands never far from their blades. Lucavion's gaze narrowed slightly as he picked out individuals who stood apart even in this crowd. Among them were several figures whose aura was undeniable, awakened warriors, their presence like steady flames amidst a gathering storm. Most hovered around the level of 3-star and 4-star, their power evident in the way their mana resonated, a controlled force waiting to be unleashed. But it was the two figures who stood slightly apart, their calm demeanor and quiet confidence distinguishing them, that caught his attention. He felt their strength like a weight in the air, 5-star awakened. Interesting, to be able to even command the 5-star awakened into this place. One was a towering man clad in darkened plate armor, a heavy axe resting against his shoulder. The other was a lithe woman. Her twin blades glinted in the sunlight, and her sharp eyes betrayed an intelligence that matched her skill. These people, Lucavion felt a weird sense of something as he looked into the two. They are the ones from the inn, aren't they? Indeed, Vitalyara confirmed, her tone tinged with curiosity. And it seems they've found themselves another stage. Or perhaps this stage has found them. Before Lucavion could dwell further on the thought, a shift in the air signaled the arrival of new figures. The murmurs of those on the deck quieted, heads turning to the gangplank as two individuals made their entrance. The first was a young woman, her beauty striking yet understated. Her blonde hair cascaded in soft waves to her waist, catching the sunlight like spun gold. Her piercing blue eyes swept across the deck, calm yet curious, as though taking in every detail. Despite her youth, there was a depth to her gaze, a quiet gravity that spoke of experience beyond her years. Beside her stood a young man, tall and broad-shouldered, his stance confident and grounded. He held a sword with practiced ease, the weapon resting against his hip as though it was an extension of himself. His expression was neutral, but his eyes carried a quiet intensity that suggested he was more than capable of holding his own among the seasoned warriors gathered here. Your little crush is here? Vitalyara commented dryly, her tone laced with sarcasm as her tail flicked against Lucavion's neck. Lucavion didn't bother to hide his smirk. I don't have a crush. She let out a low hum, clearly unconvinced. Your heartbeat spiked a little. Just saying. Lucavion waved her off with an exaggerated air of indifference. It was probably the salt in the air. Very distracting. The woman's gaze swept over the deck, pausing briefly when it landed on Lucavion. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, and in that instant, he felt the weight of her scrutiny. Her gaze wasn't hostile, but it was searching, assessing, as though she was peeling back layers in search of something unseen. Lucavion held her stare with his usual ease, the faint smirk still playing on his lips. After a heartbeat, she gave a brief, almost imperceptible nod before moving her attention elsewhere. It was a small gesture, but one that carried a quiet acknowledgement, leaving an odd, lingering impression. "She noticed you," Vitaliera observed with a hint of amusement. "Not bad, Lucavion. Not bad. You are not helping, you know. Heh." However, the man beside her didn't share her composed demeanor. As the woman's gaze moved on, his eyes remained locked on Lucavion, narrowing slightly. His stance shifted, just enough to be noticeable, and there was an edge to his expression that was difficult to mistake. Lucavion met the man's glare with an arched brow, his smirk curving into something faintly amused. Jealousy? Or just territorial? Either way, that gaze makes me feel like gouging it out. Should I just do that? His head was filled with intrusive thoughts, though of course he didn't act upon them. Creak. Just then, the captain of the 4th station made his appearance. Chapter 363. Formation. The tension on the deck was broken by the heavy creak of armored boots against the wooden planks. Heads turned as a tall, imposing man stepped into view, his mere presence commanding silence. His armor bore the insignia of the Thaddeus family, a golden trident crossed with a sword, emblazoned prominently on the breastplate. It gleamed with a practiced shine, though faint scars etched into the metal hinted at battles past. His face, much like his armor, carried the marks of experience, stern, cold, and lined with faint reminders of the dangers he had faced. "Attention," the man called out, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that left no room for disobedience. The crew and gathered adventurers straightened instinctively. Even the seasoned mercenaries paused in their conversations, their gazes snapping toward the new arrival. "I am Captain Irinder Vale," he began, his tone measured but firm. "I will be leading the 4th Station's forces for this operation. Our mission is simple but not without peril. The monsters infesting the sea trading routes threaten the duchy's commerce and stability. It is our duty to eradicate this threat and defend the city from the coming waves." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. Lucavion caught the subtle flicker of appraisal in those cold eyes as they swept over the assembled warriors. It wasn't unlike the way Lucavion himself had assessed the crowd earlier, a search for weakness, strength, and potential. Irinder continued, his voice steady. "As you have been briefed, our mages will construct stable platforms on the water's surface. These platforms will serve as our battlegrounds. They will allow us to engage the monsters on equal footing while minimizing the risk of capsizing our vessels. The city's defense will rely heavily on your coordination and discipline." A murmur rippled through the crowd, though none dared interrupt outright. The captain's demeanor left little room for frivolity. One adventurer, younger than most and clearly new to this level of danger, raised his hand hesitantly. "Captain, how are we supposed to make the monsters come to us? Aren't they just out there in the sea? Won't they avoid us if we're standing on these platforms?" Captain Irinder's cold gaze fixed on the man, and for a moment, silence stretched unbearably. Then, with a faint, humorless smirk, he replied. "You misunderstand your role here," he said, his tone cutting. "The monsters will come to you because you are their bait. That is what it means to be an adventurer, a soldier, or a mercenary in the service of the duchy. You signed on for this. You knew the risks." The bluntness of his words sent a ripple of unease through the adventurers, though none could argue with the truth of them. The young man who had spoken seemed to shrink slightly, his question dissipating under the weight of the captain's answer. Irinder's gaze swept the deck once more, his voice rising slightly to recapture the room. "Every one of you was chosen for this mission because of your skill, your experience, and your willingness to face the unknown. This is not a simple hunt. It is a battle for survival and prosperity. If any among you doubts your resolve, I suggest you leave now." No one moved. Satisfied, the captain nodded sharply. "Good. We will set sail in 1 hour. Let's first talk about our formation." Captain Irinder's gaze lingered on the silent crowd for a moment longer before he continued. "Since this is a quickly assembled team, It would be foolish to expect you to function as a fully trained unit. That said, I will provide a basic overview of the formation. Coordination is optional. Survival is not. He gestured to a map pinned to a board near the center of the deck. The crude diagram depicted the positions of the platforms that would be created by the mages and the ships that would act as bases for support and resupply. There are 3 mages assigned to this station. Given their limited number, they will be evenly distributed across the formation to ensure stability. Each platform will serve as a focal point for battle, and the fighters will be responsible for holding the monsters at bay while the mages maintain the constructs. Do not let the platforms collapse. If they do, you will be swimming in a sea filled with creatures eager to drag you under. The adventurers and mercenaries exchanged uneasy glances but remained silent. Fighters will be assigned to positions based on their apparent capabilities and preferences. Those who wish to work together as a unit, speak up now. His sharp eyes scanned the group, waiting. A handful of mercenary groups stepped forward, their leaders quietly discussing arrangements with the captain. Irinder nodded as he made swift decisions, assigning these groups to positions where their cohesion would prove most effective. His efficiency left no room for argument. For the rest of you, he said, turning his attention back to the crowd, your roles will be assigned based on observed skill and ranking. Once the platforms are deployed, follow the guidelines provided, but ultimately fight to survive. He gestured to one of his aides, who handed him a list. Irinder began calling names and assigning positions, his voice carrying clearly over the deck. Finally, he reached Lucavion. Luca, he said, his tone neutral as he read the name from the list. You're D-rank, so I'll place you toward the center of the formation. You'll have support from both flanks, and you'll be close enough to the ship to resupply if needed. Lucavion inclined his head, his smirk faint as he responded. Understood, Captain. Irinder's gaze lingered on him briefly, as if weighing his response, before he moved on to the next name. Middle of the formation? Vitaliera remarked with a soft hum. That's quite strategic. They want you close enough to pull your weight, but not so far out that you'll be overwhelmed. Or perhaps they just don't trust the D-rank adventurer to handle anything more. Critical, Lucavion replied inwardly, his smirk deepening. Maybe. Vitaliara's voice carried a note of amusement. But we both know ranks don't tell the whole story, do they? Exactly. Lucavion's gaze shifted to the others assigned near him, noting their equipment, stances, and auras. Each one seemed competent, though none stood out as particularly exceptional. Good enough to hold their own, but not enough to cause problems. Captain Irinder's eyes shifted toward the trio of mages standing slightly apart from the rest of the group. Their presence was subdued but vital, the faint hum of mana surrounding them like an invisible veil. He studied them briefly, his sharp gaze lingering on each in turn before he began assigning their positions. Mage Tarion, he said, addressing a stocky man with a dark cloak draped over his shoulders. The man looked up, his expression calm but focused. You'll be stationed at clock 9. Hold the western flank steady. Tarion gave a firm nod, adjusting the intricate staff he carried. Understood, Captain. Mage Caldris, Irinder continued, turning to the next figure. This one was a thin, wiry man with sharp features and robes adorned with faintly glowing runes. You'll take the middle, clock 12. Caldris inclined his head, his expression betraying no emotion. I'll see it done. Finally, Irinder's gaze settled on the blonde woman who had drawn Lucavion's attention earlier. Her blue eyes met the captain's, a flicker of nervousness visible despite her composed demeanor. Mage Alara, Irinder said, his tone softening slightly but still firm. You'll take the eastern flank, clock 3. Since you and Warrior Cedric seem to be acquaintances, I've placed him beside you for additional support. The woman, Alara, nodded, her golden hair catching the light as she dipped her head in acknowledgement. Thank you, Captain. I won't let the formation falter. Beside her, the man identified as Cedric, tall, broad-shouldered, and the one who had glared at Lucavion earlier, straightened slightly at the mention of his name. His expression was stoic, but there was a subtle air of protectiveness about him as he glanced toward Alara. Alara, Vitaliera murmured in Lucavion's mind. So she has a name. And a friend, it seems. A friend. It appears that someone is looking for being more than a friend. He thought inwardly. A friend with an intense glare. Jealousy, perhaps? Vitaliera teased, her tone carrying a mischievous lilt. Perhaps, Lucavion replied inwardly, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. But that's his problem, not mine. Alara seemed unaware of the silent exchange between Lucavion and Cedric. Her focus remained on Captain Arinder, her hands clasped in front of her staff as she steadied herself. Despite the faint nervousness in her demeanor, there was a quiet determination in her eyes, one that spoke of resolve beneath her polished exterior. Good, Arinder said after a brief pause, his tone final. All of you remember your positions. Once the platforms are active, communication between stations will be limited. Mages prioritize stability above all else. Warriors ensure the mages can focus on their tasks without interruption. Now prepare yourselves. We set sail shortly. With his orders given, the captain turned and strode toward the helm, his movements brisk and efficient. Lucavion leaned back against the railing, his dark eyes drifting toward Alara as she exchanged a few words with Cedric. The man's protective stance didn't escape Lucavion's notice, nor did the subtle way Alara's nervous energy seem to ease in Cedric's presence. Quite the dynamic, Vitaliera remarked with a playful hum. Careful, Lucavion. You might end up in the middle of something far messier than this expedition. Well, isn't that why we are here? He thought, though he did not say that out loud. Chapter 364. Formation 2. Alara stood at the docks, the sea breeze tugging gently at her golden hair as she scanned the bustling scene around her. Despite the chatter of the crew, the steady rhythm of boots against wood, and the occasional barked orders from nearby officers, her focus drifted inward. This is it, she thought, her grip tightening slightly around the staff in her hands. Her palms felt clammy despite the cool air. The first real battle. No controlled training grounds, no mentors watching from the sidelines. Just me, my magic, and... She glanced around at the gathered adventurers and mercenaries, her gaze lingering on the hardened faces and weathered gear. These people, it was impossible not to notice how strong they looked. Every movement they made, from adjusting their weapons to the way they carried themselves, spoke of experience, battles fought and survived. They weren't just here for glory. They were here because they knew how to survive in places where others wouldn't. Her eyes fell on a man clad in blackened armor, the heavy plates dark as storm clouds and marked with scars that told their own stories. He stood near the edge of the docks, his massive axe resting casually against his shoulder. Though he wasn't speaking, his presence seemed to fill the space around him, like a thunderhead ready to break. He's powerful, Alara thought, a faint shiver running through her. I can feel it, even from here. That kind of confidence doesn't come from bravado. He knows what he's capable of. She quickly averted her gaze, not wanting to draw his attention. And I'm not sure I want to know what that is. Her attention shifted to a woman standing nearby, twin blades crossed at her back. Her movements were precise and calculated, each step deliberate as she spoke in low tones to another mercenary. The sunlight glinted off her weapons, and the sharpness of her eyes, as they scanned the crowd, made Alara's stomach twist with unease. Her, too, Alara mused, swallowing the lump in her throat. She's not just strong, she's focused, dangerous, like she's always one step ahead of everyone else. Of course, that was mostly her glazing, but for a mage trainee like her who was doing this for the first time, her perception of reality was quite different. She let out a slow breath, steadying herself against the rising tide of nerves. The sheer strength of the adventurers and mercenaries around her was undeniable, but it was also undeniable that she had her own strengths. Nervous or not, I'm ready, she thought, gripping her staff with firm resolve. I've trained for this, worked for this. I've studied spells until my hands shook from overuse and listened to every word my master said as if it were sacred. She straightened her back, letting the weight of those lessons fill her with confidence. Master always told me to trust in my abilities, no matter how daunting the task. And I will. Her gaze flicked to Cedric, who was overseeing the loading of supplies nearby. The steady presence of her knight, a rock in every storm they had faced together, brought a faint smile to her lips. Cedric's been by my side through everything. If anyone can be trusted to hold the line, it's him. She glanced down at her staff, the polished wood cool against her fingers. It was more than a weapon, it was a symbol of her master's trust in her abilities. Her master's teachings were etched into her every movement, every spell she cast. I've faced difficulties before, and I've overcome them. This is just one more step forward. I can do this. A sense of calm began to settle over her, smoothing the jagged edges of her nerves. The weight of doubt lightened as she planted her feet more firmly on the docks. And then her gaze shifted, almost involuntarily, drawn to a figure standing not too far away. Luca, was it? She thought, the name coming unbidden to her mind. The young man stood with a casual confidence, his coat swaying lightly in the sea breeze. His posture was relaxed, his expression unreadable. But there was something about him that snagged her attention and refused to let go. Her brow furrowed slightly as she studied him, trying to decipher the strange feeling stirring within her. There was nothing remarkable about his appearance. His face was normal, not particularly handsome, not unattractive, just ordinary. Even the scar running diagonally across his eye, while distinct, wasn't enough to stand out in a place like this, filled with battle-worn veterans and hardened warriors. Why does he feel so familiar? She wondered, tilting her head slightly. I've never met anyone with a scar like that, nor do I remember someone with those features. And yet, the sensation wasn't one of recognition exactly, but it was close, like trying to recall a dream that lingered just out of reach. The harder she tried to place him, the more elusive the feeling became. Her thoughts tangled, looping back on themselves with no clear answer. It doesn't make any sense, she admitted to herself. He's just normal, not the kind of person I'd remember. Yet, her gaze lingered, her curiosity refusing to dissipate. There was something undeniably odd about the pull she felt toward him, as though her instincts were trying to tell her something her mind couldn't grasp. She wasn't one to question her instincts lightly. After all, they had been her guiding star more than once. Whether in sparring matches, navigating difficult decisions, or surviving challenges she'd thought beyond her ability, her instincts had never led her astray. They've brought me this far, she thought, her fingers brushing the smooth surface of her staff. And if they're telling me to pay attention to him, there must be a reason. Still, the reason eluded her. Luca didn't carry himself like the other adventurers and mercenaries. His confidence wasn't loud or ostentatious. It was quiet, understated, the kind that seemed to hum just beneath the surface. He wasn't the type to draw attention, and yet here she was, unable to look away for long. I wonder how strong he is, she mused, the thought forming almost unbidden. Her lips pressed together as she tried to weigh the possibility. Is he really exceptional? Or am I making a mistake? The question lingered, unanswered but insistent. Her instincts didn't often misfire, and that made her all the more curious. She tilted her head slightly, studying him from a distance. His stance was relaxed, almost lazy, but there was a tension in the way he moved, a coiled readiness that belied his casual demeanor. There's something there, she thought, her brows furrowing. I can feel it. He's hiding something. Strength, maybe? Or something else. Her thoughts raced as she watched him. Luca's sharp eyes flicked over the crowd with a detached ease, as if he were cataloging the strengths and weaknesses of everyone around him. His movements were deliberate, yet unhurried, like someone who had no reason to rush or worry. Just weird. He was just weird. Lady Elara? Hearing Cedric's voice, she came to herself. Are you listening? Seeing him looking at her like that, she just averted her gaze a little. Well, let's stop it, Elara. This is not the time to be wondering about useless things. I was distracted a little bit. Cedric's gaze lingered on her for a moment, his expression unreadable. The steady hum of activity around them seemed to fade as he studied her, the weight of his silence pressing against her thoughts. Finally, he glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing slightly as they landed on the young man named Luca. There was no mistaking the faint flicker of suspicion in his expression as he took in Luca's casual posture and sharp, assessing gaze. "Be careful about him," Cedric said quietly, his tone firm but low enough that only Alara could hear. His hand rested lightly on the hilt of his sword, an instinctive gesture of readiness. "I don't have a good feeling about him." Alara blinked, caught off guard by the comment. "Luca?" she asked, her voice soft but incredulous. "Why?" Cedric's eyes shifted back to her, his expression darkening just enough to reveal his unease. "I don't know," he admitted, his jaw tightening slightly. "It's just, something about him feels off. The way he carries himself, the way he looks at everyone here. He doesn't feel like the others." His grip on the hilt of his sword tightened for a moment before he let out a measured breath, visibly steadying himself. "He's dangerous. I'm sure of it." Alara's lips parted slightly in surprise. "Really?" Alara frowned slightly, her gaze shifting between Cedric and Luca. "Really?" she repeated, her tone soft but edged with doubt. "I mean, he hasn't done anything wrong. He doesn't seem like a bad person." Cedric's expression didn't waver. If anything, his unease deepened. "That's exactly why you should be cautious," he said, his voice low and firm. Alara let out a quiet sigh, her brows knitting together. "I don't know, Cedric. That man in the black armor with the axe, or the woman with the twin swords, they feel more dangerous to me. At least their power is obvious." Cedric shook his head, his grip tightening briefly on the hilt of his sword. "That's exactly the point. You can see what they are, clear as day. You can prepare for someone like that. But him?" He gestured subtly toward Luca without taking his eyes off Alara. "He's different. He's hiding something, and that makes him more dangerous." Alara glanced back at Luca, watching as he adjusted his coat and shifted his weight, still relaxed and unconcerned. "If you say so," and then she nodded. Just then the captain entered the docks. "Get ready. We are sailing." It was the time to fight. Chapter 365. A good show? The sharp bark of Captain Arinder's command cut through the bustling docks. "Get ready. We are sailing." The atmosphere shifted instantly, tension snapping taut like a drawn bowstring. The crew sprang into action, casting off lines and adjusting sails with practiced precision. The adventurers, mercenaries, and mages hurried to their positions, their earlier conversations replaced by grim silence. Everyone knew what was coming, the first step into danger. Lucavion pushed off from the railing and moved toward his designated spot near the middle of the formation. Around him, the organized chaos of departure swirled, a symphony of shouts, creaking wood, and the steady crash of waves against the hull. He inhaled deeply, the salty tang of the sea air filling his lungs. "Here we go," he thought, his smirk returning as he adjusted the collar of his coat. "Excited?" Vitaliera asked, perched lightly on his shoulder, her glowing form shimmering faintly. "I wouldn't call it excitement," Lucavion replied inwardly, "but there's something invigorating about stepping into chaos." The ship lurched gently as it began to move, the sails catching the wind. The crew members moved with purpose, their actions fluid and synchronized. As the docks faded into the distance, the open sea stretched before them, vast, glittering, and deceptively serene. The platforms were conjured as they neared the first area of infestation. The three mages, stationed at clock 9, 12, and 3 as directed, channeled their mana into the water. Waves shimmered as glowing symbols etched themselves into the air, forming intricate magical constructs that hovered just above the surface. Slowly, the constructs solidified into stable platforms, their surfaces smooth and unyielding. Lucavion stood near his assigned position, observing the process with mild interest. Impressive, he admitted inwardly. If nothing else, they've mastered the art of creating a battlefield where none should exist. The adventurers and mercenaries stepped onto the platforms, their movements cautious at first. Weapons were drawn, shields raised, and spells prepared. The air was thick with anticipation, the tension mounting as the group waited for the inevitable. A distant rumble echoed across the water, low and guttural. It vibrated through the air, sending ripples across the platforms and drawing every eye to the horizon. "They're coming," someone muttered, their voice barely above a whisper. The sea began to churn, waves rising unnaturally as if disturbed by an unseen force. Then, breaking through the water's surface, the first creature appeared. A hulking, grotesque form with scales glinting like tarnished metal. Its elongated body twisted unnaturally, and its maw opened to reveal rows of jagged teeth. Behind it, more creatures emerged, their numbers growing rapidly until the horizon was dotted with monstrous shapes. The distant rumble became a cacophony of snarls, growls, and the wet slap of bodies surging through the water. "Hold your positions," Captain Arinder's voice rang out, clear and commanding. "Do not break the line." Lucavion's smirk widened as he unsheathed his weapon, the blade gleaming faintly in the magical light. The flame of Equinox flickered to life at its edge, the delicate balance of life and death coiling like a serpent. "They're here," Vitaliera murmured, her tone tinged with a mix of wariness and anticipation. "Good," Lucavion thought, his gaze fixed on the approaching horde. "Let's see how much fun this chaos can offer." With the first clash imminent, Lucavion adjusted his stance, ready to meet the monsters head-on as the battle began. A smaller ship drifted some distance from the fourth station, its sleek hull cutting through the gentle waves with quiet grace. Unlike the 6 larger vessels stationed at key positions for the expedition, this one was built for mobility rather than combat. Its sails were smaller, its deck more compact, and its crew limited to a select few tasked with ensuring the safety of its singular passenger. Eliana stood at the ship's railing, her veiled face turned toward the chaotic battle unfolding in the distance. The wind tugged at her heavy robes, the fabric billowing softly as she gripped the railing with gloved hands. Even from this distance, the clash was a spectacle of movement and sound. Flashes of magic, the glint of steel, the guttural roars of the creatures, and the resounding shouts of the expedition teams. Her heart pounded, the pulse of adrenaline foreign yet intoxicating. For the first time in years, she wasn't confined to the suffocating walls of her chamber or the carefully curated gardens of the estate. Here, on the open sea, with danger in the air and the horizon stretching endlessly before her, she felt something she hadn't in a long time, alive. "Is everything to your satisfaction, my lady?" Madalena's voice broke through her thoughts, calm yet laced with subtle concern. The attendant stood a respectful distance behind her, ever watchful. Eliana didn't respond immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the distant platforms, where Captain Arinder's team was engaged in combat. The sight was both mesmerizing and unsettling. The monsters were hideous, their forms unnatural and grotesque as they surged toward the platforms. The adventurers and mercenaries moved with precision, their actions coordinated and deliberate, but the sheer number of creatures made it clear this fight would not be an easy one. "It's different," Eliana said finally, her voice muffled by the veil but steady. "Different, my lady?" Madalena asked, tilting her head slightly. "From how they described it," Eliana replied. "The maids, the books. They always spoke of the sea as something beautiful, something untamed yet magnificent. But this," she gestured faintly toward the battle. "This is chaos." Madalena approached cautiously, her gaze flicking briefly toward the distant clash. "The sea has always been both beautiful and dangerous, my lady. Perhaps this is simply the side you were never shown." Eliana's lips pressed into a thin line beneath the veil. She said nothing, her grip tightening on the railing as her eyes darted from one point of the battle to another. She watched as Captain Arinder's commanding presence kept his team steady, even as waves of monsters crashed against the platforms. His voice carried over the water, sharp and authoritative, ensuring the line didn't falter. From this distance, she could only observe. She couldn't hear the full weight of their shouts or feel the ground tremble beneath the force of the strikes. But even in this detached state, the raw energy of the battle seeped into her chest, filling the hollow ache that had lingered there for so long. Madalena stepped closer, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "The vantage point is secure, my lady," she said gently. "You'll remain safe here." The Duke was insistent. Eliana's jaw tightened at the mention of her father. "I know," she said curtly. "I can see that much." Her gaze swept across the platforms, her focus lingering on the fourth station. Captain Arinder's team was methodical, their formation holding strong despite the relentless onslaught. The monsters fell one after another, their grotesque bodies collapsing into the water in lifeless heaps. But then her eyes caught something. A flash of movement, too fast and too erratic to belong to the expedition team. A single figure moved with unnerving precision, their blade glinting in the light as they cut through the chaos with an almost unnatural ease. She didn't know his name, but even from here, she could tell he was different. His movements were calculated yet fluid, his strikes deadly accurate. It was as if he thrived in the chaos, his presence an anomaly. "Who is that?" she murmured, more to herself than to Madalena. Madalena followed her gaze, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm not certain, my lady. Likely one of the mercenaries or adventurers hired for the expedition." "Interesting." Eliana's eyes narrowed behind the veil as she continued to watch the lone figure. The long blade he wielded flashed intermittently, catching the light, but it wasn't just ordinary light. The faint blackish glow that emanated from the weapon was unlike anything she'd seen before. It wasn't a dull sheen or a reflection of the sun. It was dark, almost shadowy, yet illuminated by subtle, twinkling sparks. "What is that?" she thought, her brows furrowing. The light felt unnatural, otherworldly, a contradiction in itself. It was dark but radiant, as though it carried the essence of starlight within its depths. Her mind raced, struggling to make sense of it. A starlight? The term echoed in her thoughts, but even as she considered it, she felt uncertain. Was there even a mana accumulation technique that could produce something like this? She had studied magic in her earlier years, and while her knowledge was incomplete, she had never encountered anything remotely similar. It was as if the blade defied the very principles of mana she understood. Her gaze shifted back to the young man. He moved with unnerving precision, cutting through the chaos as though it were a carefully choreographed dance. Each strike of his blade was deliberate, each movement calculated to exploit the monster's weaknesses. Their grotesque forms crumbled beneath his onslaught, their snarls silenced before they could even reach him. Eliana found herself transfixed. The rest of the adventurers and mercenaries fought valiantly, their skills honed and their formations steady. Captain Arinder's leadership ensured the fourth station held its ground. But even from her distant vantage point, it was clear that none of them shone like the young man. "Well, at the very least, thank you for showing me a good show for my final moments. This was a saving grace, was it not?" Chapter 366. Frost Magic. Alara's breath hitched as the first creature broke the water's surface. The grotesque form, its twisted body glinting wetly in the sunlight, sent a chill of unease through her. Then another appeared, and another. Soon, the horizon was a writhing mass of monstrosities. Her grip on her staff tightened, her knuckles whitening. "Focus," she told herself, heart pounding in her chest. Her master's voice echoed in her mind. "Fear is natural. Control it or it will control you." "Lady Alara," Cedric called, his voice steady as he stepped onto the platform nearest hers. His sword was drawn, its edge gleaming. "Stay behind the line. You're the key to holding this formation. We've got this." She nodded quickly, her eyes flicking to the mercenaries bracing for impact. Their confidence was reassuring, but her nerves remained. She had trained for this, prepared for this, and yet the sight of those creatures made her feel small. "This is no different than practice," she reminded herself. "Just more chaotic." Raising her staff, she planted it firmly on the ground, drawing a deep breath as she began channeling mana. The air around her cooled, frost forming in delicate patterns along the platform. "Hold the line," Captain Arinder's voice boomed, cutting through the cacophony of snarls and crashing waves. "Defend the mages." Alara's fingers moved with practiced precision, tracing intricate symbols in the air. She focused on the first wave of creatures surging toward the platform, their forms growing larger with every moment. "Freeze," she whispered, releasing her first spell, Frostveil Lance. A crystalline shard of ice materialized before her, gleaming with sharp edges. With a flick of her staff, she sent it hurtling toward the nearest creature. Swoosh! It was a 2-star spell for the magic accumulation art she was using. Creak! The lance struck true, piercing through the monster's scaled hide and freezing the water around it. The creature screeched, its movements slowing as frost crept across its body. The impact bolstered her confidence. She adjusted her stance, steadying her trembling hands. Her fingers tightened on her staff as she steadied herself for another cast. The success of her first spell gave her a fleeting sense of control, but the writhing horde advancing toward them reminded her that this battle was far from over. "Focus," she whispered, her breath visible in the cold air forming around her. Her gaze fixed on the next creature surging toward the platform, its grotesque body propelled by unnaturally powerful limbs. She shifted her stance and drew a deep breath, channeling mana into the staff once more. Frost swirled around her feet as she raised her hand, forming a new spell. Frostvine Snare, 1-star spell. From the water beneath the creature, frost shot upward in curling vines, twisting around its limbs with a harsh crack. The vines locked the creature in place, freezing its movements as the icy tendrils tightened. The monster roared, thrashing against the bindings, but the frost held firm. "Good," Cedric shouted over the chaos. "Keep them contained." His sword flashed as he cut down a smaller creature that had darted past the front line. Alara nodded, sweat forming on her brow despite the cold. The strain of constant casting was starting to weigh on her, but she couldn't let up now. She pivoted toward another part of the battlefield where a larger creature was pressing dangerously close to the platform. "This one's tougher," she muttered, raising her staff again. Her mana surged, and she began forming a more powerful spell. Glacial Edge Barrage 2-star spell. Above her, jagged shards of ice formed in a slow, deliberate arc worklink. The sound of cracking frost filled the air as the shards hovered, glinting in the sunlight. Alara swung her staff downward, releasing the spell with a sharp whoosh. The icy projectiles shot forward, slicing through the air and embedding themselves into the creature's hide with a resounding thunk crack. Each shard exploded on impact, spreading frost across the monster's body. It bellowed in pain, its movements sluggish as the frost seeped into its joints. Alara's chest heaved, the effort of the spell leaving her momentarily lightheaded. "I need to conserve mana," she muttered, shifting her stance to prepare for the next wave. Shorter casts, faster. Around her, the battlefield was alive with noise. Mercenaries shouting, steel clashing, and the guttural snarls of the creatures. She focused on the sounds of her allies holding the line, grounding herself against the chaos. A smaller creature darted toward the rear of the formation, its sharp claws glinting ominously. Alara turned quickly, her staff already glowing with frost. Icy Flicker 1-star spell. With a flick of her wrist, a thin, precise beam of ice shot from the staff. Zing! The beam struck the creature's legs, freezing them solid and causing it to collapse with a muffled thud. A mercenary quickly stepped in to deliver the killing blow. "Nice shot," the mercenary called over his shoulder. Alara gave a brief nod, too focused to respond. The relentless waves of creatures kept coming, their grotesque forms breaking through the surf like shadows against the horizon. Alara shifted her attention again, spotting a group of smaller monsters closing in together. She gritted her teeth, channeling mana once more. Frostbound Cascade, 2-star spell. A stream of frost shot from her staff, spreading across the water with a sound like shattering glass. Crash crackle. The ice surged toward the group of creatures, enveloping them in a growing sheet of ice. Their snarls turned to muffled howls as the frost immobilized them, locking them in place. The battlefield gradually quieted as the last of the creatures collapsed under a coordinated assault from the adventurers and mercenaries. Their guttural snarls faded into the rhythmic crash of waves against the icy platforms, and a collective exhale swept through the defenders. Elara lowered her staff, her arms trembling slightly from exertion. Frost clung to her fingers and the hem of her cloak, a testament to the spells she'd cast in rapid succession. She inhaled deeply, trying to calm her racing heart as the adrenaline slowly ebbed away. "That's the first wave down," one of the mercenaries nearby called out, his voice rough but relieved. Cheers rose from a few others, though most remained focused, their eyes scanning the horizon for signs of the next attack. Elara let herself relax for a brief moment, feeling the strain of her magic settling in her core. Her reserves weren't depleted yet, but the heavy spells had taken their toll. "Lady Elara," Cedric's voice came from behind her, steady and reassuring. She turned to see him approaching, his sword sheathed but his sharp gaze still scanning the area. He held out a small vial filled with a shimmering blue liquid. "A mana potion," he said simply, extending it toward her. Her eyes widened slightly. Mana potions were rare and expensive, usually reserved for emergencies or the wealthiest of mages. "Cedric, you didn't have to." "You need it," he interrupted, his tone firm but gentle. "No point in holding back when there's more to come." Elara hesitated for only a second before taking the vial. She uncorked it and took a small sip, feeling the cool liquid flow through her, spreading warmth as it replenished her mana reserves. The tightness in her chest eased slightly as her core responded, the potion's effects enhancing her natural recovery. She let out a soft sigh of relief. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "I really needed that." Cedric gave a small nod, his expression softening for a moment. "You've been holding your own out there. But don't push yourself too hard. There's still a long way to go." Elara smiled faintly, his words grounding her. "I'll be careful. Promise." Sliding the potion back into its protective casing at her belt, she reached for her water flask. The cool, fresh taste was a welcome relief against the dryness in her throat, and she took a few measured gulps before capping it and slinging it back over her shoulder. "Ready for the next wave?" Cedric asked, his eyes watching her closely. Elara straightened, her grip tightening on her staff. "Always," she replied, her tone carrying a quiet determination. Cedric smirked faintly, his confidence in her unwavering. "Good. They'll be coming soon enough. Stay sharp." As Cedric moved off to check on the other defenders, Elara turned her attention back to the open sea, her eyes scanning the horizon. The icy platforms glistened under the dim light, their stability a testament to the mages holding them together. The lull in battle gave her a brief chance to breathe, but she knew it wouldn't last. "What do you think?" On the other hand, Lucavion was watching the exchange between the two. "Humph, she is quite good." And Vitaliera was honest. "Really?" Though Lucavion would disagree with her this time. Chapter 367. Frost Magic 2. At that time, when the fight was going on, Lucavion was also observing Elara from the corner of his eyes. Since most of the monsters for the beginner waves were rather on the weaker side, he was able to easily overcome any of these situations without much mistakes. He'd positioned himself deliberately, ensuring he had a clear view of her movements, her spells, and the choices she made in combat. After all, observing her was one of the reasons he had chosen the fourth station. And as the skirmish unfolded, things developed just as he had expected. Elara's skill was evident, her control over ice magic precise, her casting swift, and her presence on the battlefield steady. The crystalline frost forming at her feet, the lethal efficiency of her spells, and the way she adapted to the flow of the fight all spoke to her training and talent. Impressive, Lucavion thought, his smirk faint but approving. But flawed, his sharp gaze caught the details others overlooked. The spell choices she made often seemed disproportionate to the threats she faced. For smaller, weaker monsters, she occasionally overcompensated, using high-tier spells that drained her mana unnecessarily. Meanwhile, against tougher creatures, her initial responses were occasionally lacking, as though she underestimated the danger they posed until she adjusted mid-combat. "Humph!" Vital Yara's voice purred in his mind, laced with genuine observation. She's quite good. Really? Lucavion thought, his tone skeptical as he watched her cast another high-tier spell against a mid-tier monster, freezing it completely but wasting valuable resources in the process. She's talented, yes, but raw. You sound unimpressed, Vitaliera remarked, her tail flicking lightly against his neck. Shouldn't you be cheering her on? This isn't about cheering, he replied inwardly, his smirk growing faintly. This is about understanding. She has power but no nuance. Her inexperience shows in how she uses that power. Care to explain? O wise one. Lucavion's gaze didn't waver from Alara as she regrouped, her staff glowing faintly as she prepared another spell. She doesn't understand the monsters she's facing. Not fully. She's compensating with raw force when precision would suffice. Against weaker enemies, she's wasting mana. Against stronger ones, she's playing catch-up because she doesn't recognize their threat until it's too late. Vitaliera hummed thoughtfully. I see what you mean. She's adjusting on the fly, but her lack of knowledge is forcing her to fight harder, not smarter. Exactly, Lucavion agreed, his smirk softening into something more contemplative. She doesn't have a framework to rely on. No understanding of the creature's strengths, weaknesses, or patterns. That's her blind spot. He didn't mention to Vitaliera the real reason for his insight, the fact that he already knew Alara's strengths and weaknesses from the novel. It was a delicate balance to maintain, keeping his knowledge of this world's underlying story to himself while leveraging it as a tool. Still, she held her own. Vitaliera pointed out, her tone almost defensive. You can't deny that. True, Lucavion admitted. Her raw talent carried her through, and her determination is admirable. But talent only gets you so far. Without knowledge, she's at a disadvantage she doesn't even realize she has. His gaze flicked briefly to Cedric, who remained close to Alara, offering her a mana potion and a steadying word. The man's protective instincts were clear, and while Lucavion found them slightly grating, he couldn't deny their value. Alara needed grounding, and Cedric provided that, though Lucavion noted with a faint smirk how Cedric's sharp glares occasionally turned his way. At least she has support, Lucavion thought, his expression briefly amused. Even if he looks like he wants to cut me down for existing, you're thinking too much again, Vitaliera teased, her voice light. Just admit she's got potential and move on. Lucavion's smirk twisted into something faintly amused as he adjusted his grip on his weapon, his gaze flicking toward Vitaliara's glowing form on his shoulder. When did you start taking her side? He mused inwardly. What happened to the Vitaliera who spent all her time critiquing her every move? Vitaliera hummed softly, her tail curling lightly around his neck. Indeed, it is strange, isn't it? She replied, her tone reflective rather than defensive. But, I don't know. I suppose there's something about her that feels familiar. I can't quite place it, but it's there. Lucavion raised an eyebrow, though his expression remained otherwise neutral. Familiar? Yes. Vitaliera continued, her voice quieting as though she were searching for the words. Not entirely, but something resonates. It's like a fragment of a memory, blurry and out of reach. Maybe it's nothing, or maybe it's just her determination. It reminds me of someone. Lucavion's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, replaced by a flicker of something unspoken. His thoughts shifted inward, brushing against truths he had no intention of sharing. Not yet, at least. It's because she's the daughter of Master, he thought, the weight of the realization settling within him. He'd known it from the start, of course, but seeing Vitaliera, Master's familiar, unconsciously drawn to Alara, only confirmed what he already understood. Still, he said nothing of it aloud, his sharp mind keeping the revelation locked away for now. It's not the time. Not yet. Well, whatever the reason, he said instead. His voice light but tinged with a trace of mischief. Don't let her newfound favor go to your head. You've been surprisingly lenient. Don't get used to it, Vitaliera retorted with a faint huff, though her teasing tone returned quickly. She still has plenty to learn. I'm just saying she's not entirely hopeless. Lucavion chuckled softly, his gaze flicking back toward Alara as she steadied herself, her staff glowing faintly with frost as she prepared for the next wave. Not hopeless, huh? High praise coming from you. The sea began to churn again, signaling the arrival of more creatures. Lucavion adjusted his stance, his smirk returning as he prepared to meet the chaos head-on. Let's see how she handles what's next, he thought, his blade gleaming faintly with the soft flicker of the flame of Equinox. And I am really close to breakthrough. Indeed, this was what I had been lacking all this time. As the scene with Alara and the battle continued, Lucavion's focus subtly shifted inward. He began to sense the coiling of energy deep within him, a restlessness in his flame of Equinox, like a predator denied its feast. The pulse of the flame resonated with every slain monster, but it remained unsatisfied. So, that's what I've been missing, he mused, his gaze flicking to the battlefield strewn with the remains of lesser creatures. His blade moved almost reflexively, cutting down another foe with a clean, effortless strike. A concentrated flow of death energy. Not a single kill or a formidable foe, but an overwhelming release. A true storm of destruction. You look different, Vitaliera remarked, her voice laced with curiosity. What's on your mind? Lucavion let out a low chuckle, his grip on his weapon steady. The answer to my breakthrough, he replied. I always thought I needed stronger opponents to cross into the 4-star realm, but I've been looking at it wrong. The flame of Equinox isn't just about power. It's about balance, about feeding on the essence of life and death in harmony. And what does that mean for now? Vitaliara's tone sharpened, sensing the shift in his resolve. It means this battle isn't just a skirmish anymore, Lucavion thought, a faint smirk curling at his lips. It's the perfect crucible. And just as he had said that, the monsters surged again, their numbers growing as the intermediate waves began. Lucavion stepped forward, his blade igniting with the flame, its light casting a crimson glow against the shadowed terrain. His strikes grew sharper, more decisive, each one releasing bursts of energy that fed the hungry flame. He could feel the shift within him, the subtle cracking of the barrier that had held him back for so long. Each monster he felled added to the growing tide, their deaths fueling the equilibrium of the flame. Lucavion. Vitaliara's voice was low, almost reverent. What are you planning? He paused briefly, casting her a glance that held both amusement and determination. Just watch. This isn't something I can explain. It's something you'll feel when it happens. With that, he surged into the heart of the battle, his movements a seamless blend of precision and ferocity. Each swing of his blade ignited the flame further, the energy radiating from him growing with every passing moment. It wasn't just the monsters that fell. It was the atmosphere itself, thick with the raw essence of death, that began to shift. The world seemed to hold its breath as Lucavion pushed himself further, the flame roaring to life around him. And then, as the wave of monsters broke against him like water against stone, he felt it, a shattering within, followed by an all-consuming heat. The breakthrough came like a flood, the flame of Equinox surging to a new level. It wasn't just power. It was clarity, balance, and control, all coalescing into a single, undeniable force. Indeed, that was what I had been missing. Chapter 368. Breaking through mid-fight. The next wave began with a low, resonating growl that seemed to vibrate through the air. The sea churned violently, its surface breaking apart as more monstrous shapes emerged. This wave was larger, more ferocious, their guttural snarls and eerie cries echoing across the battlefield. Eliana's breath hitched slightly as she gripped the railing tighter. The adventurers and mercenaries responded instantly, their formations shifting with practiced precision as they prepared to meet the oncoming horde. She forced herself to tear her gaze away from the young man she had been watching. Her curiosity burned brighter now. If someone like him existed in this chaotic theater, surely there were others. She didn't want to miss them, not when the battlefield was teeming with potential. Her eyes scanned the scene, drawn to a pair of figures at the forefront of the fourth station. They stood out starkly among the others, their presence commanding attention even from her distant vantage point. The first was a massive, black-armored man wielding an enormous axe. His weapon seemed almost too large to be practical, but he handled it with surprising agility. Each swing sent monsters sprawling, their bodies crumpling under the sheer force of his strikes. His armor gleamed faintly, dark and imposing, and the mana radiating from him was palpable even at this distance. He moved like a juggernaut, relentless and unstoppable, carving through the horde with brute strength. Beside him was a woman with twin blades, her movements a stark contrast to the man's. She was quick, almost too fast to track, her dual swords flashing in the light as she darted between monsters. Her strikes were precise, each one aimed at vital points that dropped her foes in an instant. Her mana swirled around her like a storm, crackling with energy that seemed to fuel her speed and lethality. Aeliana watched them intently, her analytical mind assessing their performance. They were undoubtedly skilled, their coordination with the rest of the team seamless. The black-armored man's strength kept the monsters at bay, while the dual swordswoman's agility exploited openings with deadly efficiency. Together, they were a formidable duo, their presence commanding the battlefield. But even as she observed their prowess, a faint sense of dissatisfaction crept into her thoughts. "They're strong," she acknowledged, her fingers drumming lightly against the railing. "The man's strength is overwhelming, and the woman's speed is remarkable. They're clearly experienced." Her gaze flicked briefly back to the young man she had watched earlier. He was still fighting, his blade flashing with that strange, otherworldly light as he cut through the monsters with an elegance that seemed almost effortless. There was something about him, something that set him apart from the others. But they're just strong, she thought, her lips pressing into a thin line beneath her veil. Their movements are efficient, their power impressive. But that young man, he felt more than that. He felt deliberate, calculated, like every step, every strike was part of a greater design. Aeliana's father had drilled into her the importance of precision, of understanding the flow of battle. She had spent years watching his knights train, their movements honed to perfection. The brute force of the black-armored man and the agility of the swordswoman were commendable, but they lacked the finesse, the sheer presence, that the young man exuded. The next wave of monsters surged forward, and the battlefield erupted into chaos once more. Aeliana leaned slightly forward, her eyes scanning the scene with renewed focus. She would continue watching, continue searching. But no matter how many skilled adventurers she found, her thoughts kept returning to that lone figure, an anomaly in the sea of strength and fury. As Aeliana's gaze swept across the battlefield, it was drawn to a sudden, brilliant burst of frost. The air shimmered as an icy spear materialized mid-flight, piercing through a hulking monster and leaving a trail of crystalline shards in its wake. Another spell followed, a sweeping arc of frost that froze an entire group of creatures in their tracks. The young mage responsible stood at the edge of the platforms, her blonde hair catching the light as she unleashed her magic with practiced ease. Aeliana's eyes narrowed behind her veil. Her focus sharpened on the mage, her movements precise and her spells devastatingly effective. Ice continued to cascade down from the sky in controlled, destructive waves, the temperature in her vicinity visibly dropping. The mage's presence was commanding, her control over frost elemental mana remarkable. "Madalena," Aeliana called, her voice calm but carrying a note of curiosity. "Do you recognize her? Is she contracted to our territory?" Madalena stepped closer, her gaze following Aeliana's line of sight. She studied the blonde mage for a moment before shaking her head. "No, my lady. I don't believe she's contracted to any noble house in our lands." "Then is she from the Mage Tower?" Aeliana pressed, her tone slightly sharper. "Surely someone with such skill would be registered there." Madalena hesitated, her expression thoughtful. "I've not seen her name in the Mage Tower's registries, nor have I heard mention of a rogue mage with such abilities. If she's not registered with the tower or contracted within Stormhaven, her presence here is unusual." Aeliana's brow furrowed beneath her veil, her fingers lightly drumming against the railing. The more she thought about it, the stranger it seemed. A mage of this caliber, unaligned with any organization or territory, was an anomaly. Mages were often highly sought after, their skills a valuable asset to noble houses, guilds, and even merchant associations. "She's not a rogue," Aliana murmured, almost to herself. "Her discipline is too refined. Her control is extraordinary. She's no self-taught caster." Madalena tilted her head slightly. "It's possible she belongs to a less publicized sect or group. Or perhaps she's a freelancer hired specifically for this expedition." Aliana's gaze lingered on the blonde mage, her veil fluttering gently in the breeze as she scrutinized every movement, every spell. The frost that cascaded from the mage's hands wasn't just powerful. It carried a certain finesse, a precision that felt oddly familiar. The way the ice formed, sharp and angular, reminded her of something buried deep in her memory. "Where have I seen this before?" she thought, her fingers tightening around the railing. The clarity of the frost, the elegance in its formation, wasn't something one encountered often. It wasn't just about raw power. It was the way the magic danced, like a symphony conducted by a master. And then it clicked, or almost did. Aliana stiffened, her breath catching as a memory surfaced. It was faint, hazy around the edges, but unmistakable. Years ago, before her illness had confined her to her chambers, she had attended a grand exhibition in the capital. Among them was one who had stolen the show. Their frost magic had been unforgettable, graceful, commanding, and utterly captivating. "It can't be, right?" Aliana's mind raced as she pieced together fragments of the memory. "No, I'm imagining things," she decided, shaking her head. "That was a long time ago, and the world is full of skilled mages. It's just a coincidence." Even as she dismissed the thought, her curiosity gnawed at her. The mage's movements, the artistry of her spells, it was too similar. But Aliana wasn't one to chase shadows, not when there were more pressing things to focus on. She turned her attention back to the battlefield, her gaze zeroing in on the young man she had watched earlier. The flickering black light on his blade caught her eye once more, its strange, starlit quality captivating her in a way no other fighter had. "He's different," she thought, her lips curling faintly beneath her veil. The others, for all their strength and coordination, felt predictable, ordinary even. But this young man was something else entirely. His movements weren't just efficient. They were deliberate. The blonde mage, the armored man, the dual swordswoman. They were impressive, no doubt. But none of them held her attention the way he did. "Come on. Entertain me more." Aliana's veiled gaze remained fixed on the battlefield, her thoughts a mixture of intrigue and detached amusement. She watched the young man carve through the chaos, his blade a mesmerizing streak of black light. But then, something shifted. "What is that?" Her fingers tightened on the railing as she noticed a faint, almost imperceptible aura beginning to coil around him. Black and ethereal, it shimmered like smoke laced with stars, wrapping around his figure as though the battlefield itself acknowledged him. The air surrounding him seemed heavier, charged with an unnatural energy that made the hairs on her arms rise even from this distance. And then the sky rumbled. Aliana's eyes widened beneath her veil as the clouds above twisted unnaturally, swirling into a vortex that mirrored the chaos below. The mana in the air, the very essence of the battlefield, was converging, drawn irresistibly toward the young man at the epicenter. "What's happening?" The realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. She had seen something similar before, long ago, when she was still allowed to observe her father's knight's train. It was rare, so rare that it was spoken of in hushed tones among even the most seasoned of awakened. But she recognized it nonetheless. "He's breaking through," she thought, her breath catching. In the middle of battle, the phenomenon was unheard of for most. To break through one's limits in the midst of life-or-death combat was something that happened perhaps once in 10,000 awakened. The sheer concentration, the perfect alignment of danger, skill, and willpower, it was almost mythical. Yet here it was, unfolding before her eyes. The young man's aura darkened further, the starlit black shimmering brighter with each passing second. Or that was what her brain seemed to register, as her eyes didn't realize what she was seeing. The monsters around him seemed to hesitate, their primal instincts screaming of danger as the mana storm around him intensified. Even his allies had begun to notice, their movements faltering as they turned to witness the spectacle. This isn't normal, Aliana thought, her heartbeat quickening. For someone confined to a room for years, she had seen more than her fair share of battles. Observed them, studied them, dissected them through countless reports and retellings. But this was different. This was something extraordinary. And as the first crackle of his breakthrough echoed across the battlefield, she couldn't look away, her thoughts no longer dismissive or idle. Who are you? Chapter 369. Breaking through mid-fight, 2. The battlefield trembled under the weight of the storm gathering around Lucavion. Captain Arinder, perched atop a raised platform overseeing the chaos, squinted into the distance, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took in the swirling vortex of mana. The air crackled with energy, carrying with it a sense of inevitability, of something monumental unfolding before them. His grip tightened on the hilt of his sword, though he remained calm. He's breaking through, Arinder muttered, his voice barely above a whisper but laden with awe. Beside him, a younger knight, clad in polished armor, looked on with equal parts curiosity and unease. Captain, what's happening to that man? He asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Who is he? Where did he come from? Arinder's gaze didn't waver from Lucavion, even as the young knight's question lingered in the air. Oddballs, he said simply, his tone carrying a strange mix of respect and resignation. There are always oddballs in this world. We just happen to be witnessing one right now. The knight's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. Oddballs? Arinder glanced briefly at the younger man, the faintest trace of a smile playing on his lips. Men and women who defy expectations, who rise above even the loftiest of norms. People like him, Luca, was it? They're rare. The kind who don't just survive the battlefield. They shape it. The knight nodded slowly, though his expression betrayed more than mere curiosity. His jaw tightened, and his hand clenched around the pommel of his blade. In his eyes, faint but unmistakable, was a flicker of envy and greed. Arinder noticed. Of course, he did. He had seen that same look countless times before, in the eyes of men who aspired to greatness but lacked the patience, the will, or the fortune to achieve it. Right, he thought, his expression neutral as he turned back to the scene below. How can one not feel envy at such a sight? For all his years as a knight, years spent honing his craft, rising through the ranks, and witnessing talent after talent, Arinder couldn't deny the sting of envy even in his own chest. This wasn't just skill or power. This was something extraordinary. A man breaking through his limits, ascending to a higher realm of strength, right there on the battlefield. Sir, the knight ventured, his voice quieter now. Should we? Arinder raised a hand, silencing him. When the time comes and he needs to fall back, ensure no one interferes. Let him have his time. But that's an order, Arinder said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. His eyes remained on Lucavion, watching as the swirling black aura grew denser, the stars within it blazing brighter. We're witnessing something that goes beyond the ordinary, beyond even the exceptional. And if we interrupt, we risk ruining it. Understand? The knight swallowed hard and nodded, though the envy in his eyes lingered, unspoken but palpable. He couldn't look away from the figure at the center of the storm, the young man whose very presence seemed to warp the battlefield around him. Arinder's thoughts turned inward as he watched the phenomenon unfold. I've seen prodigies, veterans, masters of their craft. But this is something else entirely. Even after all these years, it's hard not to feel a pang of jealousy. His hand relaxed slightly on his sword. But envy or not, I know when I'm standing in the presence of something remarkable. The storm around Lucavion reached a crescendo, the vortex of mana roaring, as if the heavens themselves acknowledged the young man's breakthrough. Monsters shrank back, their primal instincts screaming of the danger emanating from him. And yet, even in the chaos, Lucavion's movements remained deliberate, his strikes calculated, as if he were the calm eye at the center of the storm. "Let him finish," Irinder said quietly, almost to himself, as the battlefield seemed to hold its collective breath. "Let him show us what he's capable of." The battlefield roared as waves of monsters surged forward, their guttural cries blending with the clash of steel and the hum of magic. Yet, amidst the chaos, Lucavion remained steadfast, his blade carving through the onslaught with unerring precision. His movements were fluid, each step and strike imbued with a confidence that seemed almost otherworldly. Captain Irinder watched intently from his vantage point, his gaze locked onto Lucavion. The swirling vortex of mana that had surrounded the young man moments ago had begun to dissipate, leaving behind a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer around him. Yet what was more striking was how Lucavion hadn't faltered, not once. He hadn't taken a single step back to focus on his breakthrough. His blade continued to weave through the chaos, cutting down monsters with a rhythm that was as methodical as it was lethal. Irinder's lips pressed into a thin line as he nodded to himself. "He's finished breaking through," he murmured, a note of awe creeping into his otherwise calm tone. The younger knight beside him shot him a puzzled glance. But he didn't retreat. How could he have? "Exactly," Irinder interrupted, his sharp eyes never leaving Lucavion. "He broke through without pausing, without stepping back. Either he had the incredible fortune to experience an epiphany at the exact moment he needed it." The knight's confusion deepened. Or, Irinder's expression darkened, his voice lowering. Or it's his talent. An innate ability so profound that even while breaking through, his body continued to move as though it was second nature. The knight's eyes widened as he turned back to Lucavion, now carving through another wave of monsters with unyielding precision. The weight of Irinder's words hung heavily in the air. "If it's the former," Irinder continued, his voice steady but laden with meaning, "then he possesses a luck so rare it's almost mythical. To break through mid-battle at the perfect moment without hesitation. That kind of fortune can shape legends. And if it's the latter," the knight ventured hesitantly. Irinder's gaze hardened, his jaw tightening as he delivered his assessment. "If it's the latter, then we're looking at a killing machine of a talent. Someone who can adapt and ascend under the most extreme pressure, all while maintaining perfect control. Such a person doesn't just survive battle. They dominate it." The knight swallowed hard, his gaze returning to Lucavion. The young man's blade flashed again, its strange, starlit aura leaving a faint trail of black light as it tore through a monstrous creature twice his size. There was no hesitation in his movements, no wasted energy. Every step, every strike was deliberate, efficient, and devastatingly effective. The battlefield crackled with tension, the energy in the air thick and charged. Captain Irinder's gaze remained fixed on Lucavion, his thoughts turning darker as the implications of the breakthrough settled in. This wasn't just an awe-inspiring display of talent or fortune. It was a dangerous phenomenon, one that could tip the balance of the battle. "Sir," the knight beside him ventured hesitantly, his voice barely above the din of combat. "The sky, it's still rumbling. The monsters." Irinder's expression remained impassive, though his eyes sharpened. "I know, the breakthrough, an Awaken's moment of ascension, was a rare and powerful event. It wasn't just a personal milestone. It was a beacon, the convergence of mana, the swirling energy, the trembling sky. It all served as a siren call to the other beings in the vicinity, monsters included. And here, in the heart of a monster wave, the consequences were clear. Already, the creatures seemed to react. The weaker ones hesitated, their primal instincts warning them of the danger radiating from Lucavion. But the stronger ones, those more attuned to mana and power, grew frenzied. Their guttural cries turned into roars, their movements more aggressive as they surged toward the epicenter of the disturbance. The knight's hand gripped his sword tightly. "Should we pull back? If this continues—" "No," Irinder said firmly, cutting him off. "This operation isn't designed for retreat. We're here to clear the waves, not run from them." But with his breakthrough acting as a beacon, "It's a strain we'll manage," Irinder finished, his tone brooking no argument. His gaze flicked back to Lucavion, who continued to fight with unyielding precision. The young man hadn't faltered, his movements as calculated and deliberate as they had been before the breakthrough began. Besides, Irinder added, almost to himself, I want to see what he can do. The knight hesitated but eventually nodded, though his unease was evident. The monster's roars grew louder, their numbers swelling as if summoned by the mana storm that had centered around Lucavion. What had been an already challenging battle was now veering dangerously close to a full-blown onslaught. Irinder's thoughts turned inward as he assessed the situation. The mana storm would eventually subside, but until then, the adventurers and mercenaries would face the brunt of its consequences. Normally, in such cases, retreating and regrouping would be the best course of action. But this wasn't a normal mission. This was an extermination effort, a deliberate, focused strike to clear the sea routes of these beasts. And you, Irinder thought, his gaze narrowing on Lucavion, you've just made this more complicated. But also, far more interesting. Adventurer Luca, Chapter 370, Evolved Monster. Lucavion's strikes grew sharper, his movements fluid as if the chaos of the battlefield was merely a well-rehearsed dance. The breakthrough coursed through him, a surge of energy unlike anything he had felt before. His flame of equinox burned brighter, steadier, the duality of life and death perfectly balanced in each flicker. It wasn't just power. It was mastery, the culmination of his struggles manifesting in every calculated step, every precise swing. I can feel it, Lucavion thought, his blade cutting through the air with a hum that resonated with his newfound strength. The pieces I've been missing. They've finally fallen into place. The battlefield trembled as monsters, sensing the shift in his aura, hesitated before charging again. This time, their roars carried a desperate edge. Lucavion's presence was no longer just a threat. It was a declaration. He wasn't here to survive, he was here to dominate. You're glowing? Vitaliera murmured, her voice tinged with wonder. Not literally, but there's a presence about you now. It's unsettling. Lucavion smirked, sidestepping a lunging beast and dispatching it with a single upward slash. Unsettling? That's quite the compliment coming from you. Don't let it go to your head, she retorted, though her tone held a note of pride. You've achieved something remarkable, yes, but the storm you've stirred will only draw stronger foes. Good, he thought, his smirk sharpening as his gaze swept the battlefield. What do you mean good? The adventurers here can still go for a long while. The fact that I attracted the monsters should mean that this will end faster. Really? Can everyone here withstand that? If they can't, then we can just retreat back. Can't we? Well, if it comes to that, those mages sure can retreat. And if something dangerous happens, I will cover for you. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. Lucavion took a deep breath, the battlefield's roars and cries dimming in his mind as he steadied himself. His blade shimmered faintly, the glow of the flame of equinox, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. Normally, he would have relished the chance to test the full extent of his newfound for-star strength, experimenting with the heightened balance of life and death that now burned within him. But this wasn't the time for indulgence. Stability was key. This battlefield isn't a testing ground, he thought, his smirk fading into a sharp, focused expression. It's a stage. And right now, the audience demands efficiency. He took another breath and activated his first core, Devourer of Stars. The air around him shifted as starlight mana coiled around his form, faint streaks of silver and black intertwining like threads of the cosmos. The energy settled over him, not heavy but invigorating, like the whisper of a distant nebula. And then he moved. In an instant, Lucavion dove into the wave of oncoming monsters, his blade a blur of starlit arcs. The first creature, a hulking beast with jagged tusks and molten eyes, barely had time to react before his strike cleaved through it, leaving a trail of shimmering light. The starlight mana surged, amplifying his strength, and he felt an almost intoxicating lightness in his movements. This breakthrough wasn't just about mana control. He realized as his next strike felled another monster with ease. My body, my very foundation, has been strengthened. Makes sense. Breaking through to 4-star wasn't just a mental feat. It was physical. That energy barrier was stronger than anything I faced. And for good reason. He twirled his blade, starlight radiating outward in a controlled burst that pushed back the smaller creatures surrounding him. Swoosh! A serpent-like creature lunged at him, its fangs dripping with venom that hissed as it hit the ground. Lucavion shifted, his blade slicing cleanly through its neck. Stab! The venom evaporated in the heat of the flame of equinox, leaving only a faint, acrid scent. You're moving differently. What do you mean? Let's say your fire is different now. Well, that is the point of breakthrough. Indeed, but it is still much more than I thought. I feel the same. It is a bit hard to control right now. Careful. On the right. Swoosh. Lucavion's wrist turned with precision, his blade angling upward as the leaping sea monster descended upon him. Stab! The long estoc glimmered for a split second, catching the faint glow of starlight mana. In one smooth motion, the blade pierced through the creature's open maw, sliding effortlessly upward until it reached the brain. The monster convulsed, its death throes shaking the ground beneath them. Lucavion raised a mana barrier around himself in an instant, shielding his body from the spray of thick, dark blood. The fluid splattered against the barrier and hissed as it evaporated, leaving only a faint tang of salt and decay in the air. Before he could exhale, another beast surged toward him. A massive, crab-like creature with jagged claws that gleamed with a metallic sheen. Its movements were swift and aggressive, each strike meant to crush or skewer. Lucavion sidestepped the first swipe, his blade carving into the creature's side with a flicker of starlight. The shell cracked under the force, but the monster pressed forward, undeterred. He pivoted smoothly, his footwork light as he deflected the next attack with the flat of his blade, angling it to redirect the force away from his core. This is endless, he thought, his breath steady even as the exertion began to mount. Around him, the battlefield was a swirling maelstrom of chaos. Monsters roaring, claws clashing against steel, and spells exploding in bursts of light and sound. They're pressing harder now, Vitaliera warned, her tone sharper than before. Focus. I'm already focused, Lucavion thought, his smirk faint as his blade found its mark again, severing the crab-like creature's vulnerable joint and leaving it to collapse with a guttural shriek. But she wasn't wrong. The tide of monsters was unrelenting, and even as he fought with precision and control, the sheer volume of enemies forced him to adapt constantly. The other adventurers and soldiers nearby were not faring much better. While they fought valiantly, their movements had begun to slow, their strikes losing some of their earlier sharpness. Lucavion's eyes flicked across the battlefield, noting the positions of key fighters and the thinning lines of defense. They're holding, but only barely, he thought, adjusting his stance as another creature, a slithering mass of tentacles and fangs, rushed him. His blade met the creature with a fluid, upward arc, the flame of equinox, igniting along its edge as it tore through the beast. The duality of life and death surged, consuming the monster's essence and leaving behind a faint shimmer in the air. And Lucavion didn't let the energy dissipate. He once again began to pull the death energy toward himself, drawing it into the flame of equinox, like a silent predator feeding on the battlefield's chaos. The flame within him grew brighter, steadier, as it absorbed the remnants of mana and life force left in the wake of his strikes. Not bad, he mused, feeling the subtle increase in strength ripple through his core. The battlefield itself is an endless resource. If I use it right, well, there was a change of reaching at least the mid-4-star by the end of the expedition, and it was a remarkable idea. Keek! Lucavion's blade danced through another foe, its shimmering edge humming with the residual power of the flame of equinox, when an ear-splitting screech ripped through the battlefield. The sound was unlike anything he'd heard before. A sharp, guttural cry that carried an undeniable weight of menace. His instincts flared, a chill running down his spine as he turned toward the source. From his right, an enormous, evolved sea serpent lunged, its scales glinting like liquid metal under the dim light. Its fangs, each as long as his arm, gleamed with venom, and its coiled body surged forward with a force that made the very air ripple. Fast! Lucavion thought, his senses kicking into overdrive as he realized he wouldn't be able to evade the attack in time. Channeling mana around his body, he braced himself, his stance lowering. The serpent's massive form bore down on him, its jaws opening wide enough to swallow him whole. With no other option, he raised his blade, the starlight mana flaring around it in a brilliant surge. Void Starfall Blade. Converge. The starlight mana condensed, spiraling into a concentrated point at the edge of his blade. As the serpent's strike collided with his weapon, Lucavion angled the blade just enough to deflect a fraction of the attack downward. The ground beneath him exploded, a deafening crack echoing as the serpent's force met earth instead of flesh. Dust and debris shot into the air, and the shockwave blasted Lucavion backward. He skidded across the battlefield, his feet digging into the ground to steady himself, but the sheer power of the attack left him breathless. When he finally came to a halt, he found himself in the middle of a raised platform, surrounded by adventurers and knights scrambling to react to the serpent's arrival. An evolved sea serpent, a commanding voice shouted. Lucavion's gaze snapped upward to see Captain Arinder, his figure framed against the chaos, his expression sharp with urgency. Kedril, the knight beside Arinder, a stocky man with a stern demeanor, nodded and leaped down alongside his captain. Both moved with practiced precision, their weapons gleaming as they took the position where Lucavion had just emptied. Keek! Yet at the same time, another similar voice echoed from the side. And it came from Alara's side.
Hello everyone. We now have a Discord server. Join us for faster updates, discussions about your favorite novels, and exclusive Discord-only content. Don't miss out. See you there. Scan the QR code on the screen or enter any of the displayed links into your browser to join our Discord.